Mike Pompeo appears headed for confirmation this week as the country's next Secretary of State. Pompeo will replace Rex Tillerson, who was fired by President Trump last month. Tillerson's controversial tenure is part of the story of America's shifting foreign policy. That is the subject of a new book called War on Peace: The End of Diplomacy and the Decline of American Influence. Journalist Ronan Farrow looks at the long-term decline of the State Department and what he calls the growing militarization of U.S. foreign policy.
Ronan Farrow spent several years working at the State Department, including in the office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Last week, The New Yorker won a Pulitzer Prize for Farrow's coverage of Harvey Weinstein. He's a contributing writer at the magazine. Ronan Farrow joins us at the table. Ronan, good morning.
Such a pleasure to be here, guys.
Great to have you here.
To have you here.
You write about the decline of the State Department, that it didn't begin in January 2017, but has been going on for decades. What did you learn?
Look, invariably, when you see the headlines about what's happening at the State Department now, usually using words like war on the State Department, battle against the State Department, gutting of the State Department, it's usually accompanied by unprecedented. And the fact is, it's a new extreme, but there are a lot of precedents we can look at and draw clear lessons from. Going back to the Clinton administration, right after the end of the Cold War, we had the message of it's the economy, stupid, and a turn inward. And in fact, over the course of the 90s, a 30% cut to our diplomacy and development spending. And what happened then was our embassies around the world became underfunded. We closed a bunch of outposts around the world and lost a lot of influence in important places. And we actually shuttered 2 government agencies related to information and arms control. Clearly, in retrospect, as we confront ISIS and rising nuclear powers, those were goals we didn't want to give up.
And with that American vacuum, what country is filling that space?
Sort of a shadowy backstory across this whole book is that China is nipping at our heels and filling a lot of these spaces.
So don't get as important as what is happening in today's State Department. Don't get distracted from the larger story that you spent a long time working on. Help people who don't exactly know where and why diplomacy is so important. What is so important about diplomacy?
There's 2 ways in which this affects our day-to-day lives. One is sort of at the top level, right? There was a time in which when the United States confronted a conflict, we had peacemakers and negotiators and experts on these really complicated challenges steering things. You look at us barreling into potential meetings with North Korea, leader to leader right now. At one time, we had a unit of experts that could guide that and embed it in a long-term strategy. And what the experts are saying now is we no longer have that. We're not welcoming their views. There's a second dimension to this, though, guys, which is the basic kind of unglamorous work of diplomats protects all of us. The stamping of passports, the screening of dangerous people before they get into the country, the running of our embassies, and the pulling out of Americans who are in danger. That's all work that's being diminished right now.
Well, you say in your book that experience really matters, that in diplomacy, persuasion is a weapon of choice. And I think you raised, Ronan, some very troubling things about what's happening in the Trump administration. You said from the very first day that it really was, the transition was a big joke. They were basically told, pack your bags, and that even, as we sit here today, there are so many positions that have not been filled. This is very, very concerning.
Even though this is a vast story in the sense that it's about a fundamental shift in how America exists in the world, that we are becoming a nation without expertise, that shoots first and asks questions later a lot of the time. It's told through the lens of, as you suggest, these characters in this ravaged profession, really bravely trying to serve our country and getting kicked out en masse, as it turns out, in the first days of the administration, which is that period you're talking about there.
Without being replaced. It's interesting, you've talked to all of the living Secretary of States on record who were very candid with you, and they all seem to be saying the same thing, which is?
There's a variety of levels of candor, but look, I'll give Colin Powell as an example. He said, we are ripping the guts out of diplomacy. We are mortgaging your future.
So George Marshall went from World War II general to diplomat. In this, what you're writing about, how much does 9/11 and the fact that the U.S. has been engaged in live wars cause this shift to a more military-centric diplomacy, and what are the problems with that?
It's hugely significant, and I'm careful not to oversimplify the picture here. The world landscape changed, and the rise of the national security state is partly a consequence of these inevitable shifts that, we didn't necessarily have control over. But what I show is that in conflict after conflict, we actually have gone farther than we needed to in the direction of military dominance of the policy process, that we have actively sabotaged chances at political settlements in places like Afghanistan, for instance.
Does politics play a role? Nobody campaigns and says, I'm going to have more interagency groups. You know, they say, we're going to defeat ISIS.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, because partly this is a cultural problem. This is about a group of brave men and women who serve in dangerous places for less pay than they could get in the private sector. And yeah, there are dusty bureaucrats who, punch the clock and, are entombed in this bureaucracy and don't get a lot done. But more than that, there are wonderful men and women putting a lot on the line, and they're doing important work that isn't celebrated with a ticker tape parade when they come home. And I think that that's exploited in a really vicious way for political gain by both parties.
You also talk about, you had a front row seat working with Richard Holbrooke, who was not the most popular person.
You could say that.
On the staff. But at one point he says to you, have you taken leave of your senses? Never good when your boss says that to you, Ronan. What had you done?
Part of this book is...
with his vein popping out.
Yeah,
Let's not forget that part.
This was the last stretch of his life and an incredible career on the world stage. He was a difficult, complicated person. This is a really personal book in a lot of ways. It's also partly a memoir of my time seeing these changes firsthand as a little guy at the bottom of the totem pole in that administration. And Holbrooke was a great lens through which to view this problem. He brokered peace in Bosnia. He understood how if military might is arrayed behind diplomats, no one is saying get rid of the military, downsize the military. People are saying restore the balance in a more sensible way. And he was a great example of how that can work if you have a correct balance of power. Well,
tonight's the Time 100 list. Congratulations, you're on it. I can't imagine what your life has been like the last year, working on this and your New Yorker piece.
My life has been very tired, Gayle.
That's
and
okay.
I'm very grateful for all the sources that spoke in those stories about Weinstein, and also in this book. There's a lot of whistleblowers who put a lot on the line to tell this story.
Yes, they did.
A lot of great reporting.
Congratulations to you.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
The name of the book is called War on Peace. It goes on sale today wherever you like to buy your books. Lots of places to do that.